Hello, my name is Russell Myers, independent for U.S. President for 2024. Before I start on this today, I want to thank Wendy Chavez for your donation and your emotional support. I appreciate that more than I can tell you. All right, so by executive order, I would end all direct and indirect funding for so-called non-governmental organizations, NGOs, such as the National Endowment for Democracy, the Atlantic Council, the RAND Corporation, Cato Institute, Council on Foreign Relations, and any of their subsidiaries. For these organizations to label themselves as NGOs is inexcusable, considering the fact that they receive funding from governments, including our own. Obviously, while I could actively discourage funding from other governments for these organizations, I would have no direct influence on such funding from other governments. These organizations act consistently as external agents for the CIA and other intelligence agencies to influence democratic activities in other countries. In other words, this goes directly against the Charter of the United Nations in the form of foreign government interference in elections and the functioning of governments of other nations. These so-called NGOs are heavily staffed at all levels within the United States with former and even current CIA and other U.S. intelligence agency officials, along with former and current representatives of various weapons manufacturers. This results in these organizations being more accurately deemed as agents of foreign governments, in addition to having various specific agendas. These agendas include, but are not limited to, subversion of democracy and inciting armed conflicts, internal and external. These organizations domestically act as propaganda machines for the purpose of manipulating media coverage and hence public discourse regarding issues of foreign affairs. They are referred to by the media as think tanks, and their representatives are all too often presented as experts on foreign affairs, yet you would be hard-pressed to find a single one of these experts who will offer any view on foreign relations which does not include the direct control of other governments and violence. During the 2016 election cycle, there was much screaming regarding what amounted to a few social media ads by the Internet Research Agency, IRA, of Russian origin. This was deemed foreign interference in our election process. What most Americans are completely unaware of is that Robert Mueller filed charges against the IRA in U.S. federal court, accusing them of being agents of the Kremlin. He did not expect the IRA to have legal representation in court. To his surprise, they did have legal counsel arrive. Once that occurred, U.S. media was virtually silent on the proceedings, which is why you may have not known this even happened. On discovery of evidence, where any relevant evidence is shared between the prosecutor and the defense, the Mueller team attempted to deny discovery to the defense, claiming the evidence was classified. The court made it clear that if the prosecutor was going to lay claim to evidence against the defendants, then evidence must be disclosed. There would be no way to respond to allegations if the defendants were not allowed to know what was being alleged. In the end, the U.S. federal judge determined there was insufficient evidence to claim that the IRA had any connection to the Kremlin. The judge also imposed a gag order on Robert Mueller, barring him from making such allegations in public. This was after the Mueller report had been released to the public and less than 2 weeks before Mueller himself would eventually testify before Congress on the content of his report. This resulted first in his testimony being delayed. When he did testify, he refused to answer questions nearly 200 times. When he did respond, his response was almost consistently, "It's in the report." That response was deemed just barely legal because he did not overtly state any tie between the IRA and the Kremlin after the court decision. None of that has stopped media and other elected officials from claiming foreign interference. To be clear, there was no proven foreign government interference in our election. In fact, there was no foreign interference in our election process at all, whether by a government or a civilian entity. Yet today, some Americans will still scream maniacally about foreign interference in our election. So take a look at what these organizations do in other countries. In some cases, these organizations are directly implicated in disseminating knowledge about the construction of explosive devices and the illegal transfer of firearms into other countries. This is for the purpose of violent intervention in the functioning of other governments for political purposes favorable to Western governments, including the U.S. Compare that to a few Facebook ads which were estimated to have been seen by less than 1% of the population, and half of which only appeared after the election. Former President Jimmy Carter has stated, "The United States does not have a functioning democracy at this time." We have claimed that Juan Guaido is the legitimate president of Venezuela, while this is a person who was not even a candidate in that country's election, which the U.S. calls into question. He was not suppressed as a candidate. He never even tried to file as a candidate. The U.S. has been documented in the violent overthrow of and direct interference in elections and already democratically elected governments no less than 80 times. We have armed or funded groups listed by our own State Department as terrorist organizations in other countries, including Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the PKK-YPG. The validity of our own elections have been called into question by huge segments of our own population. From the election of George W. Bush to the 2020 election, no matter what your opinion on how valid any of these elections have been, there has been enough of a question that many Americans do not trust our own electoral system. We have never allowed external multinational observers from the UN to monitor our elections, even when this was being requested by some during the 2016 primary election cycle. This does not stop our government from laying claim to being some beacon of democracy. I am very much a fierce supporter of democracy. To lay claim to supporting democracy as an ideal means one must support democracy not only here, but in all nations at all levels. That even means when the people of a country elect officials whom our government may not agree with on all matters. We could agree with most of these governments on far more matters if we were not attempting to manipulate and dominate those nations against their will, often for the profit of U.S. corporations. I would very much love for the U.S. to be the strongest example of a functioning democracy. We have the ability and the resources. For one nation or even one leader to claim to be a leader of democracy is an oxymoron in itself. Democracy, as a concept, means the equal voice of all citizens at all levels. It does not mean removing certain parties or individuals from ballots. It does not mean limited access to debates based on subjective criteria set by two dominant parties. It does not mean refusing to recognize the results of elections we don't like the results of. It does not mean only electing candidates who have the most corporate money backing them. It does not mean overt or covert violent interference. It does not mean imposing economic threats. It does not mean funding organizations which undermine actual democratic processes. Either we support democracy as a concept or we do not. To enforce the defunding of these organizations by our government, I would appoint a special investigator to delve deep into the funding of these organizations and their interaction with or control over our governmental institutions. This investigator would be required to issue periodic reports detailing their findings. These reports would not be classified. They would be released immediately, unredacted, to the media and the public. I would actively encourage further investigation by the media. I would establish a safe means for whistleblowers to submit evidence to the special investigator should any proof of continued funding or material support for these organizations be identified or suspected. If you agree with this policy proposal, please share this message. This is a true grassroots campaign, and I need your help to spread awareness of my campaign. I cannot do this without your help. It is an unfortunate fact of our current system that a political campaign requires funding. So, if you can afford it, please donate whatever you can to help expand this campaign. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.